Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am back discussing if mystery stories are viable and would be possible in 2025, this time with the Miss Marple short stories. And I've seen comments out there from people who love this series. I personally find it a lot of fun speculating, but I've also seen some comments out there asking me like why I would care and why I would do this. And the answer is just because it's a fun exercise. I mean, Christie and these other Golden Age authors are really timeless, and I wanted to see just how timeless Christie really is. And again, this is just for fun. I'm not trying to like pick apart Christie and criticize her for not being able to be current 100 years later. But, before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel, and make sure you join the Discord server if you haven't already. Join the summation gathering community and the lively discussions going on over on Discord. And now there will be spoilers ahead, but you can use the chapter titles to skip any stories you don't want to be spoiled on. I'll start with the 13 problem stories, and I'll just go in order here. Starting out with the Tuesday Nightclub. This is the story with that name. And this is an odd one because I actually do think this murder plot would work, even if a lot of sort of like the cultural norms have changed since 1932. As a reminder, this is a short story where a man murdered his wife by poisoning the hundreds and thousands on the cake. The story hinges on a few things, including, exhuming Mrs. Jones' body, which I think is probably harder nowadays than it was back then. I don't think idle gossip is going to be enough to get a judge in 2025 to dig her up. Also, diet culture is a lot different now. I remember there was that Miss Clark who didn't eat the cake because she was dieting. And I think that probably holds true today. But the basic plot here of a man impregnating another woman, I mean, she probably wouldn't be the maid in 2025, and then murdering his wife by poisoning the sprinkles on her cake, I think that would work. There are some issues getting there. I mean, for one, ptomaine poisoning, far less an issue than it was in 1932. Remember that tinned lobster was initially to blame here. I don't know if people still buy tinned lobster nowadays. I've never seen tinned lobster in the store. I have no idea if that's still popular in England. And now there's also an issue of hundreds and thousands. And if you follow the All About Agatha podcast, you will know there's like a running joke over there about how the host didn't know what hundreds and thousands were. They're sprinkles or jimmies, that's what we would call them in the US. But I did look this up, and they are still called hundreds and thousands in England. So that red herring still works of mistaking like hundreds and thousands for hundreds and thousands of dollars or pounds in money. And I think this plot works. There are still some issues, but I think they can be gotten around. The Idle House of Astarte. And this one I was initially iffy on. I think this one is too heavy on the supernatural to like really fool anyone. I know people still believe in the supernatural today, but I think that excuse just is not going to hold water. Now, that doesn't mean this plot can't work, but I do struggle to see how it works. Remember, this is the case of the murder of Sir Richard, who collapsed on the ground away from everyone else, but then was stabbed to death. And I think a lot of what works with the story just isn't going to cut it in 2025. First of all, this happens at a party, so there will be people taking videos and taking pictures and having their phones out. Maybe you could argue because the murder takes place outside, it's too dark to see anything, and this crowd is a bit older of a crowd. But, the other major clue is everyone's costume, and because Elliot is dressed as a brigand, he would have a knife. I just think that's the kind of thing everyone in 2025 would sort of be like attuned to already. And Elliot is obviously the obvious clear suspect anyway. I don't think there's really here anything inherently impossible about stabbing a victim in front of everyone like Elliot does. But I just think it's much harder in 2025, and I think this plot wouldn't work because it's just too risky nowadays. Not that it's impossible, but I do think the murderer here is taking a pretty big risk here. Ingots of Gold, and this is a weird one because this is not a murder mystery, and I think that greatly helps its chances of happening in 2025 because the mechanics are simpler. I do think there are still complications. First, I have no idea if gardeners would work on Whit Monday anymore. Look, we don't celebrate Whit Monday in the US, so I don't know how big of a deal that is. But I don't see where this plot could go wrong. Like maybe the tire that was stolen off the landlord's truck, but again, small Cornish village here, probably not cameras. And I do think being told you can get money from a sunken Spanish ship might be a huge red flag nowadays, but there are treasure hunters still, and people who are very stupid and fall for very obvious scams all the time, especially someone like Raymond West. So I don't see why this wouldn't work in 2025. Actually, and to be fair, in 2025, the version of this would be like some kind of like crypto scam, but like a crypto scam really isn't going to work with the other mechanics here. But again, I do think this is possible. The blood-stained pavement, and this one was very tough for me. I know people said I overestimate the number of security cameras in England, but I maintain at least a hotel resort like this one would have cameras. Now, the murder of Carol, really Marjorie, takes place near a cave where I assume there would be no cameras. Now, I think a touristy area in 2025 is probably more crowded than it was in 1932 or earlier than that. The story did take place a few years prior, but I think the murder of Marjorie works. Now, can Dennis and Carol continue this scheme today? I think it would be very difficult for a married couple to have the man marry all these women, insure them, and then kill the wife off to collect the money. I think it's absolutely possible, but people do this today. It's definitely harder, and they would probably get caught. But I mean, they get caught anyway. Now, I think the one hitch here is the blood drops on the pavement that Joyce slash Joan, whatever her name is, paints. I think in 2025 she might be more suspicious of the blood, and I think more people at the resort could pose a problem. Also, cameras at the resort will sort of catch Dennis and Carol like setting up the swimsuits, but I think this is a rather minor point, so I do think this plot would work today. Motive versus opportunity, a classic conundrum that absolutely is still possible in 2025. There is no murder in this one, and this is the one where a dying man had, three nieces and nephews who were the original heirs, but then he disinherited them in favor of the Spraggs, who were clearly fraudulent mediums. And this all still works. I don't think this needs any changes at all, really. I mean, perhaps disappearing ink is a bit ridiculous of a mechanic nowadays, but it's silly, but it's still around. And I also have no problem believing someone like Mr. Claude being completely taken in by fraudulent mediums. I personally know someone who lost a person close to them and was completely taken in by a fake medium who claimed to know things from beyond the grave. That medium, by the way, a very famous, well-known person. So it absolutely can happen. This might be the easiest Christie plot to pull off nowadays. Again, is there some weird things with wills just being like a lot more secure nowadays? Yeah, but again, I think this is absolutely fine. The thumb mark of St. Peter, and a lot of this one, in my opinion, hinged on whether or not I believe people in 2025 would know black spots on a haddock are called thumb marks of St. Peter, and whether or not anyone would know what pilocarpine is. I think the murder itself probably works just fine. The pouring of eye solution into a glass, that seems like it would work today. Atropine is still used in eye solutions. The problem is in solving this because I don't think anybody calls haddock spots thumb marks of St. Peter anymore. I tried to Google it, and when you Google thumb mark of St. Peter, you get this story. You have to Google like thumb mark of St. Peter haddock and to get like that information. But the legend behind the story still exists, but I do think this is a bit too old-fashioned to work. And to be honest, it is a bit strange and convoluted, even in 1932. I just think this wouldn't be solvable through the same means as it is in the story. It is probably more solvable through like advanced forensic technology, but that's not what the story uses. So for me, I did say this wouldn't work. The blue geranium, another with a fortune teller of dubious origins. And I think this one works. Again, fortune tellers, as ridiculous as they are, people still fall for them. This one does involve an impersonation, but I think it still passes. I think there are some concerns about mixing the poison to look like smelling salts. Like, I don't know if that's still possible. I'm not an expert on poisons, so I really don't know, like, the mechanics of poisons in 2025. But I imagine this is still possible. I think someone murdering her employer to marry the rich widower still makes sense. I do think the mechanics here of the litmus paper is a bit strange. I think it doesn't actually work. Like, did no one even touch the flower? I mean, the litmus paper would have been easily seen, but that is a mechanics issue, not relevant to the change in time. So it's not relevant for the purposes of this video. So I did say the blue geranium would still be possible today. The Companion. And I don't know about this one. This is the short story where two women, Miss Barton and Miss Durant, are on vacation in Gran Canaria and one drowns. I don't think this works. And first of all, Miss Durant drowns Miss Barton in front of other people and at a resort hotel beach. There are people with camera phones out recording this. Even in the novel, she's caught doing this. But I think it's even worse today. Second, the solution involved Miss Durant taking Miss Barton's place back in England, and this just isn't going to work. As I've said in past videos, I'm very skeptical of these sort of long term impersonations and identity theft twists when assessing viability today. Short term, yes, and identity theft, yes, but not like this. This just isn't going to work, especially since the women are 40 and they probably have like Facebook and Instagram and other people know them. I just don't think impersonation has any chance of actually working today. The four suspects, and I think this is very doable. Obviously, I think like a German secret society here has to be Russian or some other like enemy nation, but other than that, I think this plot remains largely intact and still works. You could quibble about no one sending letters in the mail anymore, and I think that letter would be even more suspicious than usual today, but I think that's a very minor point, especially since it's just a clue, like an indicator for the murderer to strike, so I don't think it's that big of a deal. I also think that perhaps like the British government has better means of protecting a defector like Dr. Rosen. British governments and other governments do take in people like Dr. Rosen still, but that doesn't stop rogue nations from murdering these people either. I think this all happens all the time, so I think this plot is very doable. Again, a bit old fashioned maybe, but I still think very possible. A Christmas tragedy, and this is a hard no. As fun as this story is, there's no way this would work in 2025. First of all, people do still die of blood poisoning, but it is exceedingly rarer. I don't think the hotel maid is dying of blood poisoning here, and even if she did, I don't think her dead body is going to be left laying around for anyone to steal. And even if it were, there are cameras in a hotel, so our murderer would never be able to switch the dead maid's body for his wife's. I just think this one is near impossible to pull off in anything, even remotely regarding a Christmas tragedy. We also have the bit of like a hat not fitting. Hats a lot less common nowadays for women, especially the type of hat Miss Marple is talking about. I do believe a man would murder his wife to collect the inheritance. That I have no issue with, but that is not clearly enough to make this one work. I think this is a hard no. The Herb of Death, and this one runs into some issues as well. This is a very classic murder plot of poison foxglove leaves getting mixed in with sage and poisoning everyone, but only one person dies. And I think in 2025, I could be wrong here, but I have to imagine most British people are buying sage at the market or a store and not growing it alongside foxglove in their gardens. I could be wrong, but that is my suspicion. Now, that's all just a red herring in the story, and the murder is caused by giving the victim an extra dose via digitalin and heart medicine. Digitoxin still used today, although I would think it's probably more in a pill form, so that's an issue. But despite all of this, I do think the herb of death is still possible. I think some of the mechanics are unlikely and more difficult, but not to the extent where I think this couldn't happen. It is borderline for me, but I did say yes. I don't think it's too much of a stretch here. The Affair at the Bungalow, and this is a weird one because this story didn't actually happen, but we'll look at it anyway. And like Miss Marple said in 1932, this would not work. And that's sort of the point because Jane Hellier is a moron and she would completely botch this plan she had with her understudy to get like back at this actress who stole her boyfriend. In 2025 with social media, the switch actress thing just wouldn't work. Now, I think an interesting question is, does Jane Hellier of 2025 listen to Miss Marple and back off this plan, or does she ignore Miss Marple and try it anyway? And I think this could go either way. I mean, Jane Hellier doesn't seem like such an egomaniac that she would do this once being told it wouldn't work. I think most people would ignore Miss Marple, think they could get away with it anyway. You know, people are a lot more brazen and awful nowadays. But I think Jane Hellier wouldn't, especially since she only told this story as sort of like a test run. So once it fails, I think she does back off. Besides, in 2025, there's a lot of other ways for her to get like vicious revenge on this woman. Not to say she wouldn't come up with something else, of course, but I don't think she goes forward with this story. But again, does this work? No, but that's sort of the point. So I actually do think the story works, even if the plot doesn't work. Death by drowning, the final of the 13 problems, and I do think this one is possible. Now, I think there needs to be some changes. Mrs. Bartlett out with the laundry in a pram sounds like it's not happening in 2025. I don't know anyone who takes in extra laundry for money, but I think this issue could just easily be gotten around if she was babysitting, maybe. I think the overall plot makes a lot of sense. An out of wedlock pregnant woman allegedly commits suicide, and that would be a red herring that I think could work even today. And I think a lot of the dynamics around dating have changed, where you would still have men like Joe Ellis who wouldn't mind raising the baby, though, again, there are legal issues involved here. Sanford, the architect, probably would be forced to pay child support, and he may even want custody. There's DNA testing, paternity testing nowadays. But I do think women like Mrs. Bartlett still exist who would murder to not lose her love interest. Love and passion are two things that remain the same throughout time and location. So I do think the story works. Even the social dynamics have changed. Even the mechanics have to change very slightly, but not enough where I think it becomes a totally different story. Miss Marple tells a story, and this one is basically a simpler version of a Christmas tragedy, which means it is also a no. There are some differences, and because this is a simpler version, I think this one is maybe more possible than a Christmas tragedy. But this does take place in a hotel, and I just think one look at hotel cameras would absolutely explain what's going on here. We also have some weird like hidden identity stuff, so I think it's just harder in 2025 as well. I think Miss Marple tells the story as a better chance than a Christmas tragedy, but still very unlikely. The Case of the Perfect Maid, and this one does not have a murder, so I think, again, naturally makes this a little easier to pull off. And I think mechanics wise, this one works fine. I don't see any issue with a pair of sisters passing one sister off as an invalid who is also the titular perfect maid and then robs everybody blind. I think that all works. Now, maid, a bit odd word nowadays. She's basically a cleaning lady hired to clean these flats like once a week, and I think that makes this a lot more palatable. In other videos I did sort of render the serving class non-existent, but I do think in the way it's portrayed in this story it absolutely works today. I think potentially there are small hitches, like people just being like more protective of their valuables, not as many people hiring cleaning ladies, being less trusting of outsiders, and maybe like there's a picture of a maid somewhere on Facebook, but I don't see those as obstacles preventing this. The tape measure murder. I thought a lot about this one, and I did ultimately decide this was possible. I'm not sure, to be honest. I think there are a lot of caveats that can be overcome. For one, I don't think you're ever going to get a seamstress who will come to the house for a fitting. Now, I know this is just set up, but it's a pretty big part of the story and vital to solving it. I also find it very hard to believe you could strangle someone with a tape measure nowadays. I have loads of junk in my house, including multiple tape measures, all of which are either so cheap and flimsy they would break, or ones that are virtually indestructible that are so sharp you would cut your hands on them and the victim's neck. I feel like tape measures in 1942 are probably like of much better suited quality for strangling someone. Not that I've ever really thought about it before, but I also think something like Mrs. Spenlow and Miss Pollitt's initial theft crime might be more traceable. This would have occurred around 2005. I think the odds of them getting away with that are decreased significantly. However, I don't necessarily find any of that prevents this story from being possible today. In fact, in 2025, I think Miss Pollitt might be able to get away with this murder, or at least have a better chance of it, because seamstresses don't make house calls. I think it would be easier for her to strangle Mrs. Spenlow with a tape measure and then avoid suspicion. One of the things that clues in Miss Marple is that Miss Pollitt is a seamstress and she carries a tape measure. But in 2025, Miss Pollitt not doing house calls, and even if she's still a seamstress, I don't think the connection is nearly as strong, especially if she isn't like on the job when she commits this murder. So I do think this is possible. Sanctuary, and this was another one I said yes, it is possible, but I'm not totally sure about. As I said in the Marple novel version of this video, I do think like Chipping Cleghorn is more of a quiet British village in 2025 than St. Mary Need, so I think a shot man probably could go unseen for a while. A lot of the plot here does require a lack of knowledge of the concept of sanctuary, which I think today almost everyone is familiar with, so I think the obfuscation of the Eccles saying this was suicide doesn't really work, but again, I do think this plot could happen. Like, especially like I think in the short term they could fool a bunch. So I do think this is possible, but again, not totally sure. Strange Jest, another with no murder, and that makes it easier to pull off. I do think the characters here would feel very out of place in 2025, especially Uncle Matthew, who died and left his heirs a fortune they cannot find. I do think today people are just clearer with their legacy and what they're leaving behind. Like, I understand this is not always the case, especially if someone distrusting of banks and lawyers, but in 2025, I think most people succumb to not having any other options, but that would make for a very boring short story. So I do think this works. And it's not like there aren't like eccentric people anymore who or people who distrust banks. So overall, I think this works. And rare stamps, that is the secret inheritance, still valuable, a bit old fashioned, but definitely still valuable. Greenshaw's Folly. My initial thought here was no, this isn't possible, but I changed my mind upon thinking about it and decided this could happen. This murder plot had quite a few like moving parts, and I think all of the deception is geared toward fooling one person. And I think in 2025 that would be effective still because it's just fooling one person for a brief amount of time. And yes, it does involve a disguise and an impersonation, but I think it would be effective to fool Louisa into thinking Miss Cresswell was Miss Greenshaw, especially since she doesn't really spend a lot of time with her. And I think it could get a little dicey, but Louisa definitely seems like the kind of person this would work on. It's not deception on a grand scale, so I think it would be possible in 2025, provided that it remains for the short period of time. And finally, the case of the caretaker slash caretaker's wife. And this is the story Christie expanded into Endless Night, so I'm not going to say too much more here. I said Endless Night worked in a previous video, and because this is a simpler version of Endless Night, it also works. Like, I don't want to rehash this again. It's basically timeless. Not a lot of confusing time-dependent mechanics in this one. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on this video and what you think these stories are possible or not in 2025. Next week, we have another subgenre deep dive with the ever classic Closed Circle of Suspects. So stay tuned for that. And don't forget to join the Discord. Until next time, Mystery Files.